So hi everyone, it's the last night, but it's the second last lecture because I'm going to do two shorter lectures tonight. They should be around 30 to 40 minutes each, but it's always very hard to tell until you've actually gone and gone through them for the first time. So the first of them is on data protection. So we're just going to have a look at some of the issues around that. Now, the second one that we'll do tonight is about bias, algorithmic bias. I don't want to give you the impression that I've left these till the end because they're less important. I left them to the end because they were the ones that I knew least about at the beginning of the year. But as I've been reading up more on them, I've obviously seen and understood just how important they are. So I want you to take them as seriously as well. Because they're going to become more and more important, or they already are very important, but they're the sort of things that are just going to become bigger and bigger issues for us to try and solve, particularly with regard to what we're doing with machine learning, because we're dealing with so much data. So the first thing here, and I want to try and kind of keep it as much to something to do with autonomous vehicles, but we'll do a little bit more general stuff as well. But if we take autonomous vehicles, what's going to happen when somebody wants to get into this vehicle and move away in it, okay? And the chances are that will require some form of authentication of the passenger to gain entry and to operate it. So this can be used for a lot of different reasons. It can be things like customization of the entertainment system or the comfort settings, or if it's if it's a robo taxi, then in some way you're going to have to you pay for the thing or something. You'll pay for the ride, and therefore there'll be some sort of system usually that will authenticate who you are. Now, as this information could be used to identify an individual, it must be kept safe. So this becomes one of those things for operators of autonomous vehicles. If they're going to retain data from this, if they need it for some reason, they need to be able to keep it safe. So it becomes both a burden, but also something that's lucrative and something that has value, and therefore we have to be very careful about how we deal with that, and whether we should use it for those sort of purposes. And so with regard to location tracking, the autonomous vehicle must know where it is in order to navigate properly, and therefore this information has to be stored somewhere. And if you have a situation with connected vehicles, which, as I say, is likely where we're going to go with autonomous vehicles, where they all have to be connected to each other and talk to each other and talk to infrastructure, then we have an issue whereby you're going to have several different agents or entities that are going to have access to the information about where the car is at any given time. Now, if you couple that information with the passenger data, so we either have the ego vehicle knows who's in the car, but you also have the situation where the car might be registered to a particular individual. Then in those cases, if you couple all those pieces of information together, the passenger data and the location data, the correlation can be both beneficial and harmful. Okay, so on the beneficial side, having this information over an extended period can allow for habits to be ascertained. So in other words, you can determine the sort of times that people are likely to go and get in their car and try and go home, or try and go to the gym, or try and go to wherever they're going to go to work. And this can help with traffic congestion, because it can mean that you can decide to change traffic signals and so on to make sure that the throughput works the best. And you don't want to be doing that just as the cars arrive. You want to know kind of ahead of time what's the likely load going to be on the system and try and clear it before problems happen. Or you might want to slow all the traffic down in some way, so that it all slows down in a uniform manner, because they know that a blockage is coming. So that kind of control can be very, very useful. So it could help with traffic congestion, but it could also be used to violate the passenger's privacy. And you can understand immediately how that could be the case. That if you know, for example, or somebody has that information about a particular passenger, then they can use it for all sorts of purposes, mostly for making money, but it can be used for other things as well. So if you take law enforcement, in most democracies, they're not permitted to place something like a GPS tracker on a private vehicle without something like a warrant. Now, I'm giving broad strokes here, but that would generally be the case. And that means that you have to convince a judge or somebody like that there is cause to monitor someone. But what happens when all of our vehicles are automatically tracked? They have to be tracked simply so that we can decide where we're going. And this can be linked back to your identity. Now, we already have this problem to some extent with phones. Phones have GPS trackers on them, but you can switch them off. You can switch off the Wi-Fi, and that means that it's not constantly trying to communicate with different Wi-Fis around the place, because again, it can determine from that what your location is at any given point. But if you imagine something like the entire transport system, where at any given time there is information about where you are at any given time and what your movements are, then think about how this might enable something like a totalitarian regime rather than a democracy to crack down on political dissidents. So anybody that might be a problem for the people in power can then be monitored all of the time, and it's almost impossible for them to move around without this sort of thing happening. Even if you take something like Amazon's Ring doorbells, these were actually used by law enforcement, where law enforcement in the US in particular jurisdictions were subsidizing these and basically saying to people, well, we'll give you these for reasonable price if you sign up to allow us to use the data from them in the case that a crime has taken place in your neighborhood, and we can then use it as a surveillance mechanism. And indeed, I think there was even situations where they, if they didn't get the consent from the homeowner, that they could actually go to Amazon and try and get that data from Amazon. I think that may have changed since that, because there's quite a lot of bad press that came out of that. But that's in one of the biggest democracies in the world. You can imagine what these things might be used for if they were in a regime where the people in charge were not answerable at the ballot box, let's say, or even if they are answerable at the ballot box, they might want to ensure that anybody who was likely to vote against them might do something differently. So the reason that I'm telling you these is not that you live in one of these regimes, but that you might be producing some piece of software which you think works fine in your jurisdiction, but if it was to be sold on to a regime somewhere else, it can be used for a very different purpose. And we need to kind of keep that in mind whenever we're developing any of these models or systems of this sort. And you can also see, the typical example of where your data is going to be used is selling on this combined information. So in other words, selling on the combined information of where a vehicle is going, what its sort of habits are, and therefore what's the habits of the passenger, because we have information about the passenger that's in the car. If you sell on that information to a third party who may wish to sell products and services to individuals based on their habits. So for example, they might want to know what restaurants they regularly pass. This sort of thing would be very tempting to marketeers, and very tempting to those who have the data to sell it on as an extra revenue stream. Indeed, you can easily see an opportunity for a reduced rate or a free ride sharing in exchange for this information. So we're well used at this stage to free apps, and we rarely ever stop to think about why is the application free. And here's the old statement that if you don't know what the product is that they're selling, then you're the product, because they're basically giving you a free app so that they can collect your data. So you can see a situation where a robo-taxi company might give you a low-cost journey, but you're subjected to advertisements. Or they might give you a low-cost journey that takes a route that passes certain businesses. For example, it might pass a casino or a fast food drive-through. Now you can imagine that if you have a gambling problem and you're trying to you're trying to stop yourself going to casinos, or if you have dietary problems and you're eating too much, you might want to avoid driving past the huge signs that say the different fast food joints that are just so easy to drive into and get a drive-through meal. But if you're getting a cheap taxi ride, and it knows what your habits are, and it decides to start driving you past these places in order to tempt you to go into them, and maybe even suggesting to you, oh, you've gone here before, would you like to go here again? You can see the sort of problems that would start to come up for society, that it would be very difficult for us to then break those habits. It would just reinforce them. And that then becomes part of the transport system, which previously it has never been. So the big problem, and this is not just when autonomous vehicles come online. This is right now. We have these advanced driver assistance systems, a lot, in our vehicles, which collect all sorts of data. And while that data may not go up to servers and so on, it may not be connected to the internet. At some point, this data can become available, and it's important that we know what's happening to our data, and that companies take very seriously the protection of that data. So the real problem is that when you have multiple sensors to sense the environment and the ego vehicle location, so you've got cameras, you've got radar, you've got LiDAR, you've got inertial sensors, you've got ultrasonic, you've got GPS. Now, if this is in an autonomous vehicle, then the vehicle is driving itself. If this is in a vehicle driven by a human, then you've all of a sudden got an awful lot of information that can actually incriminate the person if they're involved in traffic violations of any description. And I'm not condoning traffic violations, but at the same time, I'm not sure we're so eager to give that, to incriminate ourselves and give that sort of information away. So these can infer driver habits, routes, destinations, all of which are revealing and the driver passenger may not know. So even if you try to anonymize this information, there's enough information there to track it back to who the person is. The other problem is that you're not just doing this for the person in the vehicle that has these sensor systems. All of the other road users, be it cyclists, pedestrians, or other drivers, they may also be identifiable through some of these sensors, particularly the cameras. If you have cameras everywhere on the road, and a lot of those cameras are all linked back to one company who can actually see a lot of that information at the one time, then you can quite easily track somebody's movements. Now, in most cases, this data might not be saved, but storage is becoming cheaper, even though we're starting to create much more data. And you do have to remember that it really depends on what the incentive is. For most companies, they would not be incentivized to keep that information unless they could use it for training. But again, if you sell into a country or a regime where it's worth them, where money is no object to try and track people who are who are against the system, then you can see how that money may well be spent in order to store that sort of information and to track people unbeknownst to them. So if this data is collected from a fleet, then it can have multiple captures of unsuspecting citizens who are effectively always in the view of one sensor or another. This data is either lucrative, as I say, or a burden. Okay, for most companies, particularly in democratic countries, it's going to be a bit of a burden because unless they're making use of that data for some reason, it's huge amounts of data. They're likely to want to dump it, but they need to make sure that it's handled in a safe way and that it's not made available. That it can't be hacked, or otherwise they have a responsibility to it. So it really depends on the point of view. But for others, it can be very lucrative if they want to sell that on in some way, so that we know what people's habits are, or if we want to track people for law enforcement reasons in a particular jurisdiction, then it's also lucrative there. So always consider how this might be treated in a jurisdiction that has a poor human rights record. What might they do with that information? And this pretty much goes for all types of technology. It can be used for good or bad. You just need to think about, is there things that we can do with the data in order to make sure that to lessen the chance that it's used for bad? So if your data tells you that someone is breaking the law, what should you do? Okay, so imagine now you're a company and you're collecting data, and there's some information there that tells you, let's say, that this particular driver is constantly speeding. What do you do with that? Do you tell law enforcement or do you not? And it could come down to the laws in the particular jurisdiction too, as to whether you have to or not. So should auto companies supply vehicle data to an insurance company, for example, because that's the next step that goes beyond that. It's not just law enforcement now. Now your insurance company might say, well, if you've got this type of vehicle and it's got all these sensors on it, we want access to those sensors. And they'll tell you it's to lower your insurance price if you're a safe driver. But of course, if you're not a safe driver in any way, then they can penalise you quite heavily for this sort of thing. So should the auto companies make that available? And in most of these cases, this will be done in a situation where they say, well, if the driver says that they're happy to hand over that information, but of course nobody's happy to hand over the information. Instead, what happens is you have no real choice as to handing over the information, or maybe you won't get insured. But that only happens if the company has a system in place that allows that information to be handed over. So maybe they should think about ways to say, no, we will never hand over that information. These are all, I don't have answers to these questions. These are more things that people have to think about as more information comes along. Should the auto company supply the owner's driving data to the police or a third party in the case of an accident? In other words, should you be incriminating yourself if you've got that data? And a good example of this is where Apple refused to unlock a terrorist's phone. So a terrorist had committed an atrocity. They had his phone. I think it was a he. They had his phone, and they wanted to break into this phone so they could try and find out about other cells that he might be operating with, and so on. Now, it was a little bit unclear as to whether Apple had the technology to do this or not. They certainly seem to suggest at that link that I have there that they had the ability to create the technology to do this. But their suggestion was, if we do that, it opens up a situation where phones can be broken into much more easily than they currently are now. Therefore, yes, in this situation, you might like help with the terrorist investigation, but that makes everybody else's privacy rights less strong. Okay, it was an interesting case to see it, and obviously people took different sides of it. But it does mean then, of course, that even if you were on the side that says Apple should have handed over that information, you might be that bit more likely to buy an Apple phone because you think, well, my data is much safer with them. Now, of course, it might be just as safe with any other company as well. It's just that they got tested, and they stood the test in that they said, no, we're just not handing over this information. That was an interesting thing for a company to do. Of course, they're a big company and they're an American company, so therefore they can sometimes say no to certain things. They have a bit more difficulty when they operate in other jurisdictions to saying no, because what can happen is those jurisdictions might just say, well, you can't operate in our jurisdiction anymore, and that then leads to a very different situation. Okay, but car companies are going to have to start to consider this sort of thing as well as to what would happen. Now, while many jurisdictions are already working on legislation for how to deal with the sort of data around vehicles and so on, it's clear that technology often moves faster than most jurisdictions can create legislation to protect citizens. Okay, we even see the cabinet, the Irish government cabinet, were discussing whether to allow vehicles on autonomous vehicles on Irish roads, to allow for testing. That's very slow for that to happen, and even if they decide yes or no, and I'm not entirely certain what they did decide, it then takes quite a long lead time from then to actually create the legislation, for people to vote on it and so on, to actually allow that to happen. So legislation moves slowly, and there's a good reason for that. It needs to be very sure of itself before it does it. But the problem is technology moves much faster than legislation can be created. So you can see a situation where there's always going to be that time lag between privacy being at risk before legislation catches up with it. So as an engineer, you need to be mindful that your first responsibility is to the public interest and your second responsibility is to your employer. Now, this can sometimes seem a strange statement to people until you actually have a proper think about it. The public interest, if the public interest and the interests of your employer are not in line with each other, in other words, if there's a conflict between them, that's a strange position to find yourself in, because you really need to consider, why is my employer not in line with the public interest? Okay, and the typical example of this was that we're able to point to simply because they got caught is Volkswagen and the emissions scandal. You have a small number of engineers who more than likely said, this is what the company wants, I'll just go and do this. And they think, well, I'm paid by the employer, it's their responsibility, it's not my responsibility. And you say things like, I'm just doing my job. Or you might even say, we're complying with the law in the particular jurisdiction. Or we haven't failed any tests, which is another one which of course in that particular scandal, they set out to fool the test because they knew exactly what what was tested for. So as an engineer, you really need to understand that your first responsibility is to the public interest, and if your company is not in line with that, that puts you in a very difficult position, and you have both the right and the responsibility to speak up with your employer at that point and say, no, I don't believe that this is in line with the public interest. So that is important, no matter what the legislation might be, because legislation in many cases, in certain jurisdictions, legislation can often be draconian simply because the right people are not in charge. But also, and legislation can change over time. There's a bit of a difference between just simply complying with legislation and the difference between right and wrong. Okay, and I think most of us have a good sense of that. So, what about anonymization? Can you anonymize the data? And there are ways of anonymizing data, and some are more useful than others. But you shouldn't be naive with this. So in other words, don't assume that simply because you've removed people's names or some sort of an ID tag from it that you've really you've anonymized the data at that point. That simply won't do it. So where multiple sensors are involved, it takes surprisingly little information to re-identify an individual, even if you've taken their name out of it. Okay, so a vehicle, let's say, that takes the same journey each day between two GPS coordinates, where one happens to be to be a residence and the other a workplace, it's not going to take a huge amount of information to then go and say, well, okay, that's such and such's house, that's where they work, that's clearly this person, and from that I now know all of the other pieces of information, and I see here that they were visiting this particular place on this particular day, or they were speeding in this particular zone, or whatever it might be. You can see how very easily you could track back to an individual, and it might be even that they're not breaking the law, but it might be just that they're frequenting some premises which may be harmful to them. And if they're somebody that's politically against the government that's in power, you can see how that information could be quite easily used against them. So in this particular case, you can see how very easy it is to re-identify somebody. There was a story, I've forgotten all of the details of it, but some of the web browsers, like I don't know, is it Google Chrome or Internet Explorer or one of them, but they would record all of the history of what person was looking at on the internet, and they then remove the details of the individuals, of who they were, or any details that would identify them, but would nonetheless package up all of the other information. And some newspaper decided to buy a load of this information from a third party on about 3 million Germans. And they were able to very easily, from other pieces of information, for example, if you log into LinkedIn, the little link on it has your name in there. So even though you think you've removed all the anonymization, or you've removed all the details of the people's names, there's little clues in different things that they visited that clearly suggest that it's this particular individual. And then you can link that back to all of their other internet history, and put them in a personally difficult situation if you release that information. Now, the newspaper didn't release the names of people, but they were able to tell, well, we know this particular person and what sort of websites and so on that they looked for, and that could make life very difficult for people. We've got the same issue when it comes to vehicles. Where somebody goes in their vehicle and the sort of places that they frequent, all of that can be problematic for somebody if somebody gets if somebody unsavory gets a hold of that information. So even if you anonymize it, it's not ever really possible to completely anonymize things, or it's very difficult. So the real thing that you would try to do is you would try to design privacy into the system, not try and protect it after it's already out. So companies should promote consumer privacy throughout their organizations and at every stage of the development in their products and services. So in the same way as you see in most modern facilities, you have quality procedures throughout the place. You don't just have a quality control department. You have health and safety throughout that environment. You need to also design in privacy into everything that you develop. So everything that you do has a privacy element to it, and you think about this. So this came from an FCC report. It's in the US. On protecting consumer privacy in an era of rapid change. And you can click on that link to see more on the detail. I've really only given a few bullet points here. So some of the things you can do is you can conduct a privacy or security risk assessment. So in the same way as you would provide a risk assessment for, health and safety, you can carry one out for privacy. Minimize the data that you collect in the first place is one of the ultimate things that you can do for privacy. If you never collect the information in the first place, then and you don't store it, then you immediately make things a little bit safer. Limited retention of data and robust disposal procedures. So it's not good enough that you just only retain it for a certain amount of time, but then you just delete it. I mean, if you delete things off a hard disk, it's never really gone. If somebody wants to get it back, they can. And that can happen even if you delete over it multiple times. So, there has to be proper, robust procedures for removing that data after a certain amount of time and knowing what the limit is on that. Test security measures before launching. Don't do that as a part of like a beta testing or otherwise. You really need to make sure that those security measures are in place. You don't want on the first few days that you release something that hackers are able to break in and get a lot of the data. You need to also ensure data accuracy, and this is actually a major thing where people have had some little piece of information incorrect about them. It might be that a criminal record has accidentally been put against their name, and this can be in a modern system, this can be extremely difficult to remove this piece of information from everywhere that it is stored. So you need to ensure from the start that the data, that if you are going to collect something, that it's at least accurate, and that it's at least correct. The last thing you want is data that's unsafe and also not correct, because that can really do harm to people. Now, industry itself has a part to play in not just waiting for governments and so on to come up with guidelines, but to have standard industry guidelines across the sector. This is useful because it makes sure that you don't have this kind of a race to the bottom that occurs where if there's no common ground between the different companies, one company will always break ranks and decide that they're going to do something with your data, and then you have a free-for-all following it down. So as an industry, it's imperative that companies work together to develop guidelines on privacy protection. The Auto Alliance, which is made up of the major car company OEMs, they've already developed a consumer privacy protection principles document, but these will need to be constantly reviewed as technology develops. And I had a quick scan through this document. It's not it's not that long of a document, and it's not that detailed. It's written in very legalistic language, as you can imagine, for something that is kind of self-regulating. So it's common agreement. Our common agreement is often the best way to ensure that there isn't a race to the bottom. But self-regulation is often a very weak form of regulation, and generally speaking, it's better if multinationally. And you see this with the European Union, where they've come up with the GDPR, that they come up with systems that across countries make sure that anybody that's selling into that particular jurisdiction has to obey particular rules. There's an excerpt here from this document, just to kind of have a read of it. So it's very legalistic language. So exclusion from covered information. If participating members collect covered information and then alter or combine the information so that the information can no longer reasonably be linked to the vehicle from which the information was retrieved, the owner of that vehicle or any other individual, the information is no longer covered information. If participating members attempt to link the information to specific identified individuals or vehicles, or share the information without prohibiting the recipients from attempting such linking, the information becomes covered information. So very legalistic, but also, I don't know how you feel about that sentence, but it doesn't give me confidence, because you see things like, if they, without prohibiting recipients from attempting such linking. Well, how do you do that? How do you make sure that a government that you sell it to, or a jurisdiction that you put it into, how do you prohibit them from not linking the information together? Those sort of things, I'd like that to be a little bit clearer. And so you can see how there's probably still a lot of work to be done on privacy with vehicles. Now, notice and consent. You've seen these on websites all the time. So you click on a website, and it's mostly to do with cookies, but all sorts of other privacy information. And what happens is you frustratedly dismiss them without actually reading them. You either click the X or you do something. Maybe you click OK. And really what this comes down to is you need to make a decision about what is the reasonable expectation of a motorist in terms of what data they expect they're giving away the right to. Because nobody really reads through all of that detail. And therefore, if it's beyond what might be expected, then you need to make it very clear to people what you're doing. So how many options will the occupant have to go through to get the car moving, for example? And if they have to click on 15 different things, well, that seems a little bit ridiculous. They should be able to get into the car, drive from A to B, and not worry about having to protect their data while they do it. So if I'm late for work, will I walk rather than give up my data? That's those are the sort of decisions that customers might be having to make, and in many cases that's not an option. If I refuse to give my data, will I be denied transportation? Again, that might seem crazy that might happen, but that could certainly be the case. That you have robo-taxis that say, well, unless we know who you are and unless we can use your information, we're not giving you a ride in the taxi, and all of a sudden you could be kept out of this. And we mentioned earlier about how you might get cheaper taxi rides if you were to give away your information, and that immediately there means that the poor are treated differently from the wealthy. So the wealthy can afford to protect their data and the poor cannot. That's not a good situation either. And in the next class, we're going to be talking about bias and some of the problems that come in with regard to that. So misuse of your system. I've been kind of hinting at this all along, and it's the same with any piece of technology that you create. How might it be used badly? So it's very easy to create a system which seems fine in the jurisdiction in which you created it. And remember that jurisdictions can change over time. You can have a change of government which can have a very, very different philosophy. And you could create something in one environment that suddenly could become a very different environment, or it could sell into some other totalitarian regime. How are you enabling are you enabling human rights violations when you do this? You need to make sure about what product it is that you're selling in, and are you protecting against that sort of thing. Privacy by design can help protect against this sort of thing. So if you've designed in that privacy that the data is removed straight away or deleted straight away, and you don't even have access to it, then it makes it much harder for somebody else to get access to it or to push you to get access to it. Don't make it possible for data to be abused is the basic takeaway there. Now, the edge systems is just kind of, as I say here, edge computing is the new fancy word for embedded systems, but actually this can be used as a privacy system. So what happens at the edge stays at the edge is a statement that I heard at a conference recently, but I'm sure it's been used elsewhere. And the idea here is that if we can do most of our processing at the vehicle, then the data can be discarded without ever leaving the vehicle. So particularly if you've got neural networks that are being used for inference or something like that, or we're taking in all the information from the different sensors, is there any need for that to go up to a cloud server and stored? Now, you could totally see where it might be useful for storage up there or for retraining. So Tesla certainly use a system whereby if something unusual happens, they store that information and send it up to the server, and then the server does some retraining on the network, and then they put that network back down into the fleet. And they also have a situation where they can ask the fleet to look out for particular types of things so that they can then record more information of unusual events. The problem is that's not staying on the edge now. That's that information coming back, and unusual events are often events that we may not want. We may not want associated with us as a passenger or as a driver. So with edge computing or embedded systems, we could help build in data protection into the systems to make sure that we always have a situation where the data is protected and it's never in a vulnerable position. So a few things here. There's this comes from a book called Ethics in Data Science, which I haven't read the full book or anything like that, but it is free. You can download it for the Kindle for free at that link. And it also, I came across this in a web page called 16 Things You Can Do to Make Tech More Ethical. So this is part of the checklist because some of the other parts are to do with bias, which I'll mention in the next lecture. So things to check. Have we listed how this technology can be attacked or abused? what kinds of user consent do we need to collect or use the data? So if we're collecting data, do we need to have the consent of people to do that? And what type of user consent do we require for that? Do we have a mechanism for gathering consent from users? Okay, and ideally that needs to be in a way that the consumer or the user is very aware of what it is that they're handing over. They're not just frustratedly clicking on something to get rid of it. Have we explained clearly to users what they're consenting to? I guess that's what I'm just after saying there, really. Is it very obvious to them? And these things can become so complex that it takes too long to explain to somebody. So you need to kind of streamline that and say, well, there's only certain purposes that we would ever use this for, and you need to be aware of that before you click OK. Do we have a mechanism for redress if people are harmed by the results? So I think that's important. I think a lot of companies, when they're developing something, they assume that nobody is ever going to get harmed, and if they are harmed, they're going to have to fight it in the courts. And instead really saying, well, actually, we need to have a system set up in place to say people should get redress if they're harmed by what we're doing. And that will quite quickly make you much more clever about making sure that people don't get harmed, rather than taking the much more kind of argumentative route. Okay, some acknowledgements here. A lot of this came from a document called The Privacy Implications of Autonomous Vehicles from the dataprotectionreport.com. So you can have a click on that link to have a look at that. Okay, so that's that first lecture over, guys. I'll just stop the recording there and we'll move on to the second one.